Welcome to the Red Light Exposé podcast.
We are an international grassroots survivor-led circle.
Our goal is to counter the growing acceptance of sex work ideology.
We aim to raise awareness of the harms of commercializing sex,
meaning prostitution, porn, stripping, and BDSM.
Through honest, in-depth conversations,
we elevate voices often ignored and silenced.
Together, we're challenging stereotypes and dismantling myths.
We envision a healthier, safer society, especially for women and girls.
We appreciate your company on this journey. Welcome back to the Red Light Exposé podcast. My name is Elly Arrow. I am an activist against sexual exploitation in Germany. Today with me on the show, I have my co-host Merly from Sweden, a survivor of prostitution, also a writer, political scientist, and poetry enthusiast. With us also is Chaucer Cameron, a poet and poetry filmmaker in the UK with an MA in creative writing from the University of Gloucester. She worked as a poetry film workshop facilitator with Swindon Poetry Festival and is a founding member of Poetry Factory Collective. Her work has been published in various journals, magazines, and online publications. Her poetry films have been screened in multiple mixed media journals and festivals both in the UK and internationally, including Zebra Poetry Film Festival in Berlin. Chaucer has co-edited 3 poetry anthologies. She's the co-editor of Poetry Film Live. She has also had work adapted and performed at Everyman Theatre in Cheltenham. Her poetry collection, In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered, is part memoir and part fiction, telling the stories of multiple women in prostitution in the 80s in London. And that's the work we'll be focusing on today. So welcome to the show, Merly, and welcome, Chaucer. I'd like to ask both of you, starting with Chaucer, when did you first start writing creatively, and what drew you to poetry in particular? Any specific influences, artists, writers that led you there?
Well, it's really great to be here, and it's nice to speak to you, both of you, and see both of you. I've always written creatively. I wasn't a confident child at school, but one of my earliest memories was of being called to the teacher's desk to practice reading. And it was one area I excelled in and I was praised for. And also my parents bought me a typewriter, which I loved. I spent a lot of time on the typewriter and discovered that I'm a natural storyteller, both orally and through the written word. And I was relatively disconnected as a child, and that was my way of connecting to myself and to others. However, my writing relationship with the typewriter temporarily broke down when I was persuaded to take evening classes in what they used to call Pitman's shorthand and typing. The typewriter became an instrument of oppression, almost torture, really. I became a gendered cog in the wheel and sort of groomed to become a secretary or something. And I knew I couldn't do that. I knew I wouldn't fit into that. I wouldn't survive that work. And so I guess that's where my writing life started. As for the question, poetry, why poetry? That's a brilliant question, actually, because up until recently, I'd not thought about it. But in preparation for this podcast, I dived into it. And what came up straight away was a memory of my father, which was a surprise. My father used to read poetry and short stories to me at bedtime, and I remember that as a really nice time. So I didn't have much of a relationship with him, but that time certainly stands out as a connection and an influence. Also, I think my mind works more efficiently when it condenses things, and poetry is by nature a condensed form of language. It can say a lot in a short space of time, and that appeals to me. I love poetry. I love the layers it inhabits. It's rather like an onion, you can peel its layers off. And there's such a rich multiplicity of literary devices to play with, such as rhyme, alliteration, metaphor, etc. All of those can be effectively used to disseminate and communicate complex ideas in creative ways. So it's a really great storytelling device. I also love poetry's compression juxtaposed to its vastness. I love the way that it can hold the juxtaposition, the way that it manages cognitive dissonance and negative capability. And as the English poet John Keats said, to accept uncertainties, mysteries and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And I love that quote because I think we all need a bit of that, really, especially in relation to writing difficult material and navigating prostitution themes and other narratives. You know, I think that answers the question about poetry. I don't have an answer to who my favourite poet is because, you know, I like them all really, and I don't hierarchize it, you know, I like them all.
Oh, as you were speaking, I'm just having memories of playing with the typewriter that my grandparents had, or still have, I think. But as you mentioned, that when you're chained to it and it's work and it's many hours every day doing it for someone else, that's an interesting, unfortunate perspective and experience. For me personally, the closest connection I have to writing has to do with songs. And of course, songs and poetry, there's an overlap there. So I've always loved female singer-songwriters, writing about female joy, female pain, female experience. In that sense, my favorite poet would probably be Fiona Apple. Some listeners might know her. She writes a lot on the female perspective, on love and heartbreak and keeping your sanity in a misogynistic world. But yeah, I'd love to turn over to Merle. What comes up for you and what's your connection to poetry and creative writing?
Well, my mother was a teacher. And as a teacher, she was very adamant about reading to us. So we read books. She read books to us. She told stories. And that made me a reader. I love to read. I don't get the time as much now. But when I was younger, you know, you would find me in the school library. And I read poetry as young, but when I got into my teens and dealt with a lot of, you know, really emotional pain, it all turned into this numbness. And I feel that when I read poetry, it touches beyond that numbness. Not as much as books, because books can't really go past that. And I'm 39, I'm having trouble with finding the focus to sit down with a full book, but poetry can always sort of touch something in me. As you said, it's layered. It tells so much in such few words. And a lot of times we are very talkative race. And poetry is sort of saying words are redundant, but I'll give you this. And, you know, just short words. I like long poems too. Like, it's not that it has to be short, but it has to be always really powerful if it's good poetry. Powerful, but without being boisterous. Do you understand the difference there?
Yeah.
So I try to read as much as I can, or, you know, share. I have an Instagram account and I sometimes share poetry, but some people seems to be a little bit on guard with poetry, but I'm going to keep posting it anyway. I think that a lot more people could fall in love with poetry if they just gave it a chance.
Yeah, so leading us into the key work from Chaucer that we'll be talking about today. This is a collection of poems, as I mentioned at the start, called In an Ideal World, I'd Not Be Murdered. And as I mentioned, it's about the experience of multiple women in prostitution in 80s London. And so, Chaucer, I'd like to ask you specifically what led you into writing about this. How did it go from an idea or a sense that you wanted to write about it to sharing it publicly, that process?
Well, the idea for the book, In an Ideal World I'd Not Be Murdered, developed over a long period of time, partly because traumatic experiences are often received in delay, and it took sort of 30 years, or maybe more than that, to achieve the emotional distance that was needed to be able to reflect through these events in my poetry. But I think the start was many years ago when I wrote a monologue called The Raid, which was staged at the Everyman Theatre. And it was based on a police raid on a brothel in 1978 in Streatham, hosted by Cynthia Payne. She was a madam in London, quite a big madam, a celebrity madam, I suppose. And Cynthia's life was made into a film called Personal Services, and that was played by an actress called Julie Walters. I followed this in 2016 with the poem Brothel Keeping in Suburbia, which I performed on International Women's Day in Bristol. And that was the beginning of the book, really. That poem didn't go into the pamphlet, but it was the start. But regarding specific scenarios in terms of the book's development, there were 3 significant triggers that prompted the book. Firstly, I was working on a poetry film collection in collaboration with Helen Dewberry, my partner in film and my partner in life. But I discovered I was writing something different. At the time, I thought I was writing about adoption, but in fact, I was writing about prostitution. But I didn't know that then at the time. In effect, I'd been writing undercover, even to my own self. And that's just one example of the impact of prostitution with its blame, shame and stigmas and silencing. You end up hiding from yourself, and worse, hiding from your creative self. And that sets up all sorts of unhealthy splits. So I felt it was a high price I paid for having to be silent for so long and self-censoring, out of fear, all sorts of reasons. And everything that comes with prostitution, you have to be quiet. But once I identified the poems as prostitution poems, everything started to flow. And I knew it was for a book, and the film would come later. The second trigger was finding out that Cynthia Payne had died. I found out in the newspaper in 2015. And Cindy was, as I said, a celebrity madam, and she was my madam, and she was known for her high-profile parties in the 70s and 80s. And she died of old age, and her death acted as a catalyst and inspired the poem Brothel Keeping in Suburbia. The third trigger was being told about the suicide of my psychotherapist, Roger Leontio, who worked in Hackney Hospital in London in the 70s. The hospital was now closed, and the police told me that he'd also been using a pseudonym. So on his death certificate, which I've got, he was known as David Tio. I don't understand that really. The therapeutic situation was sexual, and it went on for about 8 years on and off. And in the wake of Me Too, I went to the police and they discovered that he had taken his life. So all these experiences came together as a sort of catalyst to enable me to speak openly. And that is how In an Ideal World came into being. What I need to say here, I need to emphasize here, that the deaths of my abusers, Roger and Cynthia, amongst others, but those two, changed my creative life completely. I discovered a new voice when they died, and I felt a great weight had been lifted. And within a year or so, I'd published a book. And then I realised, that my whole creative writing life had been shaped by abuse, by the suppression, oppression, fear, censorship and silencing, which is inherent in all forms of abuse, but especially in prostitution. And as a creative artist, I find that aspect particularly heartbreaking, because censorship and threats to silence do shape creative thought. And that is what it's designed to do. It's an attempt to distort or shut you down. And so as a creative, you look for ways around that to subvert it and to challenge it. And that's what I ended up doing.
Okay, yeah. I'm just remembering in a most recent published episode, Marilee, we recorded it a while ago, but we spoke a lot about the abuses in the mental health field of traumatized women, both through neglect, through over-medication, but then also direct abuse. And this needs to be a bigger Me Too conversation until something changes. It's incredible the amount of abuse that happens there. And of course, our entire show is about saying prostitution is Me Too on steroids. That's essentially the core message here. Yeah, so Marilee, whenever you want to come in with anything, question or comment, just feel free to go ahead.
I have one question. Were you always open about your experiences in prostitution, or did that come after your tormentors died and you started to writing about this subject more overtly?
That's really interesting, because I always sort of thought I was open about it. But actually, apparently, according to Helen, who I've been with for a long time, 30 years, I didn't mention it. I didn't talk to anybody really about it. And then it all broke after hearing that Roger and Cynthia had died and starting writing about it. It all came out at the same time just then. Just all came out in a flood, and I came out as a prostituted woman. But I didn't realise just how hidden I'd been about it. So it's a strange place to be. But I'm not hidden about it now. I'm right out now.
Have you experienced any backlash being open about your experience?
No, I haven't experienced any backlash, as I think. I probably know that maybe some people have distanced themselves or are a bit taken aback. Because I came out with a book as well, I got the opposite. You're so brave, come out with it and everything. But looking back on that, I think maybe some of my birth family have ghosted me, maybe around the fact that I'm out and they, don't know about that. But that's no loss, or not really much of a loss. Yeah, so I haven't had a backlash that I know of, but I'm sure that it goes on.
Thank you so much.
So getting into the work specifically, it is a mix of real life experiences and fiction. And I found this interesting because I've read works from a lot of different survivors, and many have said that there is a way that you can process something in fiction that you can't when you're writing something biographical. Or many have said, I've written a biography, now I want to write creatively. And maybe about women, maybe about prostitution, maybe abuse, maybe something else. But there's, for many, a connection between the fiction and the autobiographical. Yeah, I'm interested to hear from you how you feel that goes together, fact and fiction, and I guess what remains real throughout. And I certainly felt that reading and listening is the emotions in all of it.
There is a lot of that. Actually, there wasn't a conscious decision to combine fact and fiction. The whole process was organic. I didn't really know what I was writing. And I think I had a mentor who said, that sort of fiction memoir. And I thought, oh gosh, that's what I'm doing. And I thought, that's a good phrase, I'll use that. So in the book, at the back of the book, it's part memoir, part fiction, which is what it seems to be. So to exploring that a bit more, I'm a lyric poet by default, as my default line, and I tend towards the experimental cross-genre free verse, and I approach subjects by going in slant. So this new writing that came out was radically different. It came out as narrative, direct. It employed characters and it had a plot. And I didn't know what to do with this different way of writing. It was a surprise. I was also intrigued to witness characters suddenly showing up in ways that I'd not experienced before. So, for example, the fictional character Crystal in the book permeates the book and was one of the first characters on the scene. And she was fierce and feisty and she had her own voice. Sometimes differing from mine, but I also found myself remembering and writing about real people who are now dead. So I also learned that through the characters that not only was I able to reenact the past, but also to understand what happened and speak about it. Although in these poems, the boundaries between sort of reality and fiction are blurred. But as I said before, it wasn't conscious decision to merge the two, to write one way or another. It was organic.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm a little bit of a free time hobbyist writer, just not very serious fan fiction, but still I like to create my own characters, like set them in a world that another writer has created, but make my own characters. And I do it often in times of stress and when I'm trying to process something difficult in my life. And I do find this experience of suddenly the character doing something I didn't originally intend. My plan said they would do something else, but then as I'm writing it, they're doing something new, almost like they have their own life. I can relate to that experience.
That's very exciting when you've got this character speaking back to you and they don't always agree with you. It's really interesting.
And you wonder what goes on like neurologically because there's some part of your subconscious that's doing that part because it is all you, but it feels like it's someone sitting across from you, interestingly enough. Yeah.
Yeah. That'd be interesting to look at that neurologically and put, see what lights up in the brain. Yeah.
I should mention neither Marilyn nor me are English native speakers. I know a lot of English words, but what I really loved while reading, I also learned new words from you, just lyrical words or metaphors that I just hadn't known before. There's many of them, some familiar, some new to me. I'll just highlight some that stood out to me. So there's a reoccurring theme of dining, feasting, or devouring, even mutual. So not just the Johns or the buyers, or do you call them punters? Punters, yeah. But the women as well, or the women feeling like they are. Maybe there's a hint of that at some points. But what stood out to me, a very specific image being painted by a poem about a woman being consumed like a crab in fine dining. And I think this might be a good moment to read one of the poems. I would read the title for this one, but I'm hesitant to mispronounce French.
Okay. I will say that this poem is more of a poet's poem, and it has more interest than any of the other, it's more interested. Coupe de Met. I lay you on your back, twist off your claw legs, crack them with a heavy implement. I will not allow you to shatter into small pieces yet. I will extract the bones of you, place them with care into a metal bowl. I will insert thumbs on the base of your body, push upwards to release you from your carapace. I will pull away and discard your lungs. They are only dead man's fingers, and you know them intimately, don't you? I will press your mouth with such force that it snaps from its shell. I will raid your stomach sack, cut you in half, scoop out the meat of you, fork out the white from your carcass. You will be left hollow. Your cavities will shimmer thinly, rocking back and forth, open, empty, ready to be stuffed, dressed, put on show. And then we will dine. You will be picked, handheld, lifted high on a fork, ready to be savoured by tongue, swallowed down into the gut, where you'll rest for a moment before clawing your way back through every orifice imaginable.
That one really, really sticks in my mind.
Mine too. It is chilling, but very also recognizable.
Yes.
I'm happy to go behind the scenes of this poem to explain the dynamic. I recall a moment years ago when I was an escort dining at the Hilton Hotel with a punter, when I became super conscious of my surroundings. I can only describe it as coming out of numb. And the first thing I noticed was the dynamic and game playing that was happening between us. There was a sort of weird kinetic between us. It was a heightened moment that comes back in flashbacks from time to time in high definition and in Ken Burns fashion, which is a film technique that brings movement and life to a still image. So Ken Burns goes in and out, and it comes sort of back like that. That moment has always unsettled me. So I chose to process it through the poem. And from that perspective and distance, I was able to see and process the scenario and what the poem was saying, how it articulates issues around power, consumerism, violence, and the way they impact on the body and infiltrate the mind. The crab metaphor was, again, organic. I didn't set out to put a crab in the poem. But often in my writing, an image comes up that I can't deny or dismiss. And this one wouldn't go, it just wouldn't go away. I know nothing about crabs, so I needed to research. And the language used to describe the cooking and the eating of a crab is absolutely brutal. It really is alarming and very distressing. And straight away, it brought up certain language and activities that reminded me of the violence I'd experienced and my time in the industry. So, I wasn't surprised that the image came out, demanding to speak and to be heard.
Just as we're speaking, this image is coming to my mind because I lived for a year in Japan, and there's a lot of seafood there, as it's an island nation. And I saw so many lobsters and crabs in these tanks because, in the restaurants, they want to make serve the seafood as fresh as possible. And they're in these tanks. There's nothing in the tanks. For the lobsters, they've put something on their claws so they can't use them. They are defenseless, and then they get picked up one by one and prepared. And you don't have to be a vegan or a vegetarian to feel uneasiness and compassion when you see that. You don't even have to see them being cut up, which is happening, just being in these tanks. And the tanks aren't hidden from the guests in the restaurants. They're often in the open. I found that surprising. And now, just as we're speaking, my head is like, that is a great and painful metaphor for prostitution, being sitting in the window and then getting picked and then getting slaughtered and eaten. So
yeah.
There's another metaphor that I found very interesting. Not being a native speaker, I learned a new word from you, Chaucer, and that one is palimpsest. And just in case there's anyone else listening who doesn't know what that means, could you explain it for us? And then I'd love to hear the poem that it is part of.
Yes, sure. I can certainly do that. This has been really interesting to write about, actually, for the podcast. So the dictionary definition of palimpsest is that a palimpsest is a parchment or a similar material that's been partially or completely raised to make room for another text, where the uppermost layer is the clearest, but also obscures what was previously written. And this can be used to express layerings of meanings, where one set of meanings sort of bleeds through or pokes through to another. It can be applied to other things like architecture and other domains, but as poetry, that's where it's coming from. Metaphors are everywhere. They're in life, and the way that we use metaphor and language shapes the way we see reality. I was absolutely thrilled with this question, because every time I now read the book or watch the film now, I discover the palimpsest has become a major key player, a major metaphor throughout the book and the film. Also, what I've discovered, sometimes when you're on the right track, you'll come across something or someone, more likely someone, that will try to derail you. That can be frustrating. It's also a gift, because it alerts you to the fact that you're most definitely on the right track. And this happened to me while I was researching for the podcast, around the word palimpsest and heterotopia. I noted a most strange attempt in an academic article, that tried to negate these terms. And I argue passionately that palimpsest is exactly the right concept, the right metaphor to use in order to describe aspects and issues arising specifically through sex industry experience and through the prostituted body. So palimpsest is one of the most appropriate and useful terms to describe and articulate all forms of prostitution and sex industry experience, where one is already very familiar with layering, masking, appropriating and reusing. And these people, these articles, these academics are trying to erase or destroy or distort these things. It's very annoying, but it's also very interesting.
All right. Yes, there are so many layers of meaning it can take on, then, both dissociating from what one really feels or wants to say, quieting oneself, someone else writing the narrative. So both the John in the situation, the woman having to mask for him, but also later when people tell survivors of exploitation, your narrative is not acceptable. Your narrative that this was abuse is inconvenient. And we would like to overwrite that. And I've seen it so many times that news reporters are interviewing someone who says, to me, this was paid abuse, paid rape even. And the journalist still calls them a sex worker. Now, this is often, not ill intent, but it's still just the discomfort that everyone else has with this narrative, which at least for the individual, we should be able to accept. But we struggle, and we would prefer to overwrite. So yeah, there's so much there. For listeners, I'm interested in what comes up for you when you hear palimpsest. So listeners can get the context. Chaucer, can you read body marks for us?
Okay. Body marks. Wrist. Fat slag, he'd called me. She held up both her wrists to display cuts and blisters. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. It's my time bomb. Elbows and knees, scrapes and grazes, then like a cow in heat, munched my way through balls and dick, sucked the life right out of it. Outside forearm. Cut it on a bottle hidden in the grass. That's what I told her, anyway. Mum was always kind, ready with a bandage, stitched me up, put a hand between my legs, stitched me up, stitched me up, stitched me up. Inside forearm. I am a palimpsest, she said. Beneath this rose tattoo, a barcode. And the women are named Caprice, Eve, Grace, and Morgan. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it does lead us into the next question, and that is, throughout the work, there is a lot about the trauma on the body. As we know, when the public speaks about the physical impact of prostitution, it's all about STIs and HIV. And as important as these issues are, a lot of it has this sound of, 150 years of prosecution of women in prostitution for supposedly being disease spreaders, rather than actually looking at what is this doing to her as a human being in her totality. And so there are both horrors that people don't want to hear about that come up, such as miscarriages or injuries to the most intimate parts of the body, as well as just the lack of sunlight from many brothels in their night shifts, or the lack of good nutrition. I can already hear the critics saying, oh, but many people who work night shifts have those problems and many people don't have healthy food. But if you're going through something physically and emotionally traumatizing, how are you supposed to heal or even rest in any way if these factors are there on top? So I wanted to ask what, Chaucer, your experience with communicating these things, the impact on the body in its full scope in poetry or other formats where you've spoken to people. How do they react? Is that something that people can access when there seems to be such a hesitancy in a lot of the public to actually look this in the face?
Yeah, very much so. This is such an important question, and I'm actually just at the start of researching the subject. So, I haven't fully processed it, but I will have a lot to say later at some point about it. But what I will say is that I've been thinking about sex industry injuries, specific injuries, that I argue are unique. So I think those injuries are unique to industry experience. And when you've been around as long as I have, you have a whole history carved into the body. And over time, I've discovered that although the body is resilient and canny and can give off the appearance of healing, at least the surface scars, when you bring the mind into it, when the mind and the body reconnects, which is usually after you've left prostitution, you bring the mind and the body together, it becomes a double-edged sword, because that's a time when some of those hidden injuries may reveal themselves. And I've got evidence of that. Yeah, I'm living proof of that. The body really does keep the score. So it's not all about heavy duty wounds or diseased bodies, trauma in that way. The media fixate on those, but it's much more complex and nuanced than that. It involves psychic wounding, the loss of time, which is a huge wound, and impacts on the body, the loss of self-esteem, the loss of sort of voice, or the voice not being what it should be, and the loss of agency. And as I explained before, the loss of creativity, or not having access to creativity, or it's blocked, creativity is blocked. And that's, for an artist, is really wounding, and it actually impacts on the body in odd sort of ways. So, for example, you might get lots of rashes and stuff like that, but they're not rashes that the doctor can say, oh, that's because you've, touched some washing powder. It's actually coming from the realization that somebody's been oppressing you, and it comes out in those forms. So it comes out in all sorts of forms. It's a really interesting area to explore, and it needs to be talked about a lot.
I totally agree. I have firsthand experience of having a broken, busted body. But when you try to speak to medical professionals, or even people who are working and have worked many years within this field of helping people exiting, they have so much knowledge. But when you talk to them about having chronic pains, they look at you very confused. They don't know, and they say something along the lines with trauma response. It's not really always a trauma response per se, because it's having your legs torn apart in angles that you shouldn't have them torn apart. You're not a gymnast just because you're in prostitution, and many times out of someone else's force, and you are being paid and you're being coerced. So the no doesn't really, exist in that environment that you go to every day for years or months or weeks. And I've said to so many people within the field and medical examiners that if I told you that I slipped on a patch of ice 20 years ago, you'd understand that I had back pains. But when I said that I spent 16 years in prostitution, you look at me befuddled. Like those two things can coexist. I can't be in pain for something that was a part of my life for so long. And I also think that prostitution, the sex industry being so heavily, mostly women and girls. We have some other groups, but it's mostly women and girls. And we are set to be taking all the pain all the time with a smile, just go on about our day. And I see that as a problem, a very big problem. And I'm really welcoming now that we are starting to talk about it and starting to listening to the voices that talk about that kind of pain, that it's just not just mental, but also physical. And I can see that it also ranges from young people exiting to older people exiting or have exiting for many, many years ago. It is no difference. I have a friend, well, she's on her legs now, but she was bedridden a while ago. She said because of her time in prostitution. I have another friend who is walking with a walker. She's not even 50 because her time in prostitution. And we need to be better in this area. But it was really interesting to read poems that were gripping that fact. So thank you.
Thanks. I hear you. I really hear you. I'm going through that too. The onus is always on, having to inform the health professionals. Unless they're trauma informed, you have to always either come out and they don't really know what to do with that. They don't know how to respond, and they certainly don't really help, actually. So you do end up keeping quiet about that because, of everything that you've just said. Yeah.
Thank you. I agree.
We want to take a brief moment to thank you for your listenership. As an independent volunteer collective, our episodes are only made possible because of donations from people like you. Please visit our website, www.redlightexposé.com, and click the donate button. Your support is greatly appreciated. And now, back to the episode.
In a minute, I'd like to move on and focus more on the film. But before we do, if you could read one more poem for us. So #CamGirl23, because that one also spoke to me very strongly. And I'd like to hear it, and then I'd like to share why it spoke to me.
#CamGirl23 was found in an armadillo pose, hunched over the keyboard, hooked to a screen, her index finger worn down to the bone. Tap, tap, tapping. Put years on her.
This one's also one of my favorites. I have never been in the sex trade, but I have some overlapping experience, which is depressing that there's the generation of girls now who grew up with computers. As we're exploring the digital world, just chatting to strangers, and will surprise nobody that there's a lot of predators and pedophiles looking for teenage girls online. It's not strictly what the poem is about, but it still brought it up for me, this being hooked on the screen and chatting with strange men. And I am 12, I am 13, and I am fascinated, but I'm also disgusted. And there's a part of me that knows it's not good, and another part of me that's like, it's fine. He doesn't know where I am. This is okay. And people say this so often about so-called camgirling. Even the phrase is kind of benign, like camgirling. What does that mean? It's live pornography. It's live prostitution, as I'd say now. But how serious that actually is, how you can be traumatized through a screen. And I've spoken to many survivors of the online prostitution trade, the pornography trade since, including many who said, well, I didn't have a pimp, at least not my entire time. And I thought it would be different, and it wasn't. They were able to attack or even temporarily or permanently kill a part of me through the screen. And so for me, that poem really paints something in my mind, the mix of my own experience and what I've heard from other women. There's also an artist I like, maybe I can link her work. She mostly talks about relationship trauma, draws about it. She sketches and draws and does a lot with women with skeleton arms. And so I'm seeing the finger worn down to the bone, and I can see her art style of the woman tapping on the keyboard, and really brought up a lot for me and really, really stuck. So thank you for writing it.
Oh, Well, thank you for that feedback, because it's, very unusual to hear somebody be able to articulate how they feel about the poem. That's really, really interesting. I'm glad it resonates, gets across.
I felt seen is what I want to say, that you can be heard through the screen. I felt seen through that. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say real quickly that I was involved with pornography production harm in Sweden. Film prostitution is inseparable from non-film prostitution. You can find that on prostitutionresearch.com. It is a report that we worked on, a study that we worked on for 3 years in Sweden. We interviewed 113 different actors, mostly victims or survivors or people who haven't exited yet. And it needs to be read, the effects.
So, Merle, we must do an episode about that research. And it's just been another study from Ireland of the impact of porn on young people.
We will schedule a date where we can do that. And it's headed by Dr. Melissa Farley, who has worked within this area for 4 decades. Yeah. She's just brilliant. And these kind of studies, they try to bury them rather quickly when they come out because, it's an uncomfortable subject to deal with, even in Sweden. So that's why I'm pushing it wherever I can. It's out there. So thank you. But we will schedule a date and time.
Yes. Before we move on, Merle, I know there's a poem that spoke to you a lot in particular. Do you want to share that with us and tell us why?
Because I both have pimps and been my own employer, so to say, in the sex industry. And the admin poem is also so recognizable as you being this sort of secretary to your own downfall in the industry. And it's, you perk up and you say, thanks for coming and thanks for coming so fast. That is just bam. That is more than half of my time. Just you count every second. They buy your time. They buy, different acts. But in reality, you're standing there smiling or laying there smiling and you're just like, thanks for coming, but thanks for coming fast. Oh, it's amazing.
I was just going to say thank you. Again, it's really interesting to hear how it translates to other people. I don't often read that poem for whatever, just because I don't read them all the time. But that's astonishing. Thank you for saying that.
As we brought it up, I'd love to hear that poem.
Actually, funnily enough, it's in the book, and the cam girl is on 16, administration is on 17. It's just meant to be, Administration. Amy worked in admin, met clients in the office. Evenings, it was shorthand. Ladders always featured, as did stockings and a stockroom. Balanced on a middle rung. Oh, hello, Mr. Carter. Yes, I've nearly finished. It's so nice of you to come, and so quickly.
Yeah.
It's just chilling. Thank you.
Moving on to focusing on the film version. So just for the audience who haven't seen it, in the film, we have the poems read out by Chaucer, as well as a male and female voice actor. And underneath are sound effects and music, while the visuals change, and there's both still and moving images. There's calm and busy camera work, photography, abstract images, montages, animation. There's really a plethora of styles weaving this work together. And as Merle and I mentioned, there is reading the work and then there's hearing and seeing it, and it creates another level of immersion. Adding sound effects like the sound of a punch or the barking of a dog or the lapping of water and the whistling and howling of wind, it really deepens the memory. Again, I would be interested what brain scientists say about how our memory works. I found with these added components, there's a deepened sense of closeness to the women whose portraits is painted, and Chaucer to you as the author. And it really does feel like stepping into a memory. Merle, do you want to share a little bit more how you experienced these new layers?
Yes, it was very non-traumatizing, I would say, but still I spent many years in the industry and also in brothel. I was in a brothel in Copenhagen for a little over a year. I just felt like reading about scars on their arms. You can't see me now because I don't have a video, but the scars on my arms, when I read that, I just choked up a little bit. because I love the rawness of it. I love the unapologetic description. And also from our time, especially in the brothel, you're amongst your peers, in the lack of a better words, but you're also always on edge because everyone is on edge. You know each other, but you know nothing of each other. And it comes across so clearly in Crystal and in her interactions. I would say if someone wants to devour your work, I would say read first, then watch the movie. You can do it the other way, but I felt like having read first and then seeing everything again, but with all this very carefully done and well done cinematic experience, it's mind-blowing, and it's really just crosses that line where you feel like, oh my God, it's goes from pages to just life. And I think that for someone who hasn't had the experience of being in the sex industry, it's just more beneficial to do it that way, not to skip a step, because we're so used to watch something like, oh, do you read a book today? No, I see a movie. It hasn't come out as a movie yet. And I think that you miss something very valuable if you don't read it. And I think that you should read it first. I just felt like it just tied it all together.
And so to focus in on the process of making the film, I wanted to ask, because this work is so personal, what was it like letting other people be part of the creative process, right? Because it was a group of people, multiple people working together on different parts and aspects. What made you decide to want to work with other people? And then what was that like? Because I'm asking, I don't know, it feels vulnerable to let people in and make parts of it for you and see if your visions align and what comes up for people and for you.
So producing our film was always on the cards, and Helen and I talked a lot about it. So it was very collaborative, and we wrote lots of notes and we shared lots of ideas, and I was always very involved in the film in that way. And I don't think I would have trusted anyone with Ideal World. I wouldn't have trusted anyone else with it, because we've lived together for over 30 years and she remembers things that I've said that I don't remember saying, but are nonetheless true. So she knows and she understands my story, and she knows and she understands London, and that was important. And I was able to trust her, bringing other people in. I'll just say that the person who's singing in Hallelujah is somebody who was in the sex industry and now exited, and she was involved in that way. It was important to have somebody with lived experience in it. The voiceover, other than myself, hasn't had lived experience. So we did have a range of people in it. So the collaborative aspect was very structured and very deliberate. We did struggle with trying to find another voice. We got Kim and that was good. So the collaborative aspect worked quite well, really.
Oh, I'm glad, because I've heard of survivors making films with people, and it's a sensitive space. It can be re-exploitative, unfortunately. And I've heard a number of women who've made that experience. And so I'm glad it went well for you, and it was, a more of a connecting experience. And I wanted to also ask specifically about Hallelujah, because the song comes up at the opening of the film and as intermission. And I don't know the exact details, but my understanding is that the original author of the song, it's been covered a million times, right? It's the song that people sing at karaoke. But originally it's by Leonard Cohen, and it's often been interpreted as an expression of processing abuse, possibly abuse from a lover or abuse from a mother. I was interested to know the reason that you chose this specific song to be part of the film.
As I just said, Hallelujah was sung by a friend who had lived experience, and she just sent it. She's now exited, and the decision to include people with lived experience was not up for debate. That had to be part of it. And when Helen heard the song, that was it. She immediately thought, without having any reference to other things around it particularly, she immediately thought that we could use that for the film. And so it was really just a serendipitous thing. It just happened. Helen used the image of a jetty in the film. A jet comes into the water, appearing momentarily in the Thames, alluding to the ferryman Chiron, travelling across the waters, carrying souls, separating of the living and the dead. And Hallelujah is heard in the distance, catching us between two places, our personal everyday experience and the search for something else. And the idea in the film is that we may ourselves wander the shores in search of a home or rest against all odds and against the constant drag towards the underworld. And so Hallelujah sort of merges in as well. I personally love the low, eerie sound of the wind in the film, which permeates it, which is more than ambient sound. As a metaphor, the wind has the ability to destroy, and the struggles and challenges in its wake are something to be overcome. So Hallelujah sort of came into its own in that way.
In the end of the movie, you and your partner are talking about the work creating the film, not trying to re-traumatize the viewer and writing not to re-traumatize. I would like to hear your thoughts, if you can unbox that for us or talk to that a little bit, because I myself am writing a book now, and I feel that I'm re-traumatizing myself. What am I doing to the reader, who the potential reader who's going to read this, and how not to?
Yes, yeah. About traumatic memories, coming up for you or for one. In my experience attending events and conferences about prostitution, I've obviously noticed that time is spent on sharing personal histories. And these often take the forms of testimonies when women go on stage and autobiographical storytelling. Now, this focus on storytelling is vital. It enables agency and it gives witness to experience, and it opens up a space to be seen and heard. And this in turn enables the possibility or probability that one can more than survive afterwards. However, I've been to quite a few conferences, and I do have concerns about the retelling of these stories in the traditional way, with all the accompanying traumas. You see these people on stage and they go on too long and they get quite traumatized, and so does the audience. I think to myself, that there's much to be gained by adding a balance to the storytelling narrative. And so through poetry and poetry film might be a way to supplement that or to use it. For me, this has been a revelation, because the book and the film are entirely different experiences, both in terms of writing and participating, as well as practical involvement. So in terms of dealing with traumatic memory regarding the book has been out for 3 years. And as I said elsewhere, it almost wrote itself. And I think I wrote it in a dissociative state of being anyway. But I've read it a lot now, and any flashbacks or distances that come up in performance are slight and manageable. Although there's a disconnect between the head and body, and by that I mean I feel fine and enjoy reading and performing. I do like being on stage, but my body tends to react a day or so later, so I get a headache or aches and pains or something happens. And that's part of the territory, I think. More so, though, for poets who are reading hard or writing exposing material. And very recently, in fact, yesterday, I heard that the Welsh poet Gwyneth Lewis, she was a Welsh laureate, has just launched her memoir called Nightshade Mother. And she gave an interview to The Guardian, which is a paper. And in it, she says, "I know that poetry isn't all benign therapy. As well as being a cathartic form of self-expression, it can also give insights that a person isn't ready psychologically to handle. So if it can heal, if art can heal, art can also harm." Now, that's a very sort of Gwyneth Lewis statement. It's a very brave statement, and it really spoke to me. And that is most certainly something to be aware of. And it's something that I believe I'm dealing with now in terms of my reaction to live poetry film. So to complicate things regarding traumatic memory and writing it down and filming it, I admit I was somewhat naive in thinking that I would not be impacted by going back to the geographical sources of trauma to film, for example. And so I think that maybe some of the things that happened on location that led me to some form of PTSD are now possibly filtering through when I watch the film, because I find the film very difficult in live events, but also very informative. It's something that I'm going to be looking at. For me, it was important to locate as much of the filming as we could in locations in London to give authentic connection to the actual place where the remembered events happened. So, for instance, when I returned to, say, 128 Farley Road, which used to be the entrance to a brothel, the experience evoked a certain phenomena, a ghostly presence, but not in the way that I imagined or predicted. And before I arrived at the building to film the scene, I searched for it online and discovered that Farley Road only went up to 124. 128 wasn't listed as being there, but I knew it was there because I'd been there. But that shows how fragile, your own sense of reality can be. I'm also constantly aware of the concept of visibility and invisibility and how that manifests in prostitution. A body that's for sale must perform visibility and invisibility at the same time. It must be on show, and yet it must stay hidden in plain sight. And I realised that the scenario being played out was reflective of prostitution and what prostitution and being in heterotopic space, a liminal area, looks and feels like, crossing over back and forth from one world to another. So disappearances, and both psychologically, physically and psychically, become a way of life in prostitution. And I found the apparent disappearance of that particular building in Farley Road really difficult to process. The second thing regarding sort of traumatic memory and how to talk about it or write about it, that happened again outside the brothel. While I was there, I felt a ghostly presence, a man standing beside me. And in the past, that had actually happened. I'd been standing outside the house and a man was by my side. But at that time, he had an Alsatian dog with him. But I didn't remember the dog when I was filming. And when we got home, I watched it back, and Helen had put the sound of a dog barking from inside the house in the film. And I must have mentioned something about the dog to her at some point in the past. I talked to her and I never remember what I say often if I'm talking about these things. And so hearing the dog was a surprise, and the impact was really significant. It blew me away. It was huge. To summarise, I believe that this whole process can be used to illustrate aspects of traumatic memory and can be used as a vehicle to receive traumatic memory, process traumatic memory, and then access the potential to reframe it so it can be seen and heard and it doesn't slip away into murky depths of denial. I'm not totally sure I answered the question for you.
Yes, you did. I'm really grateful for that answer. And I just wanted to say that when I read the book and I watched the movie, you succeeded. You did something that I think that as a survivor, I didn't feel traumatized. I felt kindred. It was a lot of familiarity, but I didn't feel re-traumatized. And I think that had to do with that you seem to, and you tell me if I'm wrong here, but you seem to lean into the rawness of it. And that is also something that I experience when I meet other survivors. There's a rawness to our memories, to our experiences, rather than when you read the newspapers trying to give interviews and talk about the sex industry, there almost always some sort of eroticization. And I think that when you cross that bridge to eroticization, that's where I feel re-traumatized, mainly because it's wrong and it feels like another violation of my experiences and the experiences of so many others. But I hear you and I'm really grateful. Thank you.
How to portray trauma while avoiding re-traumatization of the artist and the audience. And I'd like to talk about how this was done, because I thought it was done excellently and movingly. And we said it already, it's a big issue because the media, it loves glamorization, it loves trauma porn, it likes to show suffering, it likes high heels. That's the go-to image on every news article, right? The way it was done in your film, there are multiple ways that stood out. So we have the trapped butterfly, we have the burning rose, a rose burning very, very slowly, which brought memory to me of Rachel Moran, an Irish survivor and writer, talking about how punters, they want young women because paying to abuse a young woman is like pissing on a young bloom. I believe that was her choice of words. And we also have the image of building demolition. And this really created a strong atmosphere, and all of these stuck with me. And then finally, there's the female mannequin, and it is full of stickers reminiscent of a common tattoo style with flowers and sort of flowing shapes. And I also found this interesting because I did my bachelor's degree in arts and I made a series of short videos where punters are quoted. So I had a voice actor read real punter quotes from German men. And one of the images I used for illustration were also female mannequins that I had filmed in like shop windows because I didn't have any funding. And so I just looked, what can I film in my own city? What's there? And the mannequin is there. And I'm sure we've all had this experience where when you're only seeing the mannequin out of the corner of your eye, you think there's a person there. Have you had that experience? I'm sure, yeah, right? Most people have. And so I found all of these very powerful, and I'm interested to know, I'm sure I can imagine there was a lot of experimentation, and what happened so that these were some of the ones you settled on, and what do they mean to you?
Yeah, that's just brilliant though, isn't it? I mean, the way that people use these things and the feedback that we've had, which is really interesting. What, people keep going back to the butterfly and the rose and the mannequin. That's interesting how you've used it. And I'd love to see those videos you've done. It was a very important decision right from the start. Try not to re-traumatize or fetishize the body. So like poetry film can operate in compressed and abstract worlds. So one way to address this was by using characters in place of images, as in the poem Body Marks, where Ash held off a stab wound through her laugh. That comes to mind. And sound is always going to be important, especially as a metaphor. Another way to portray body harm in a sort of non-cliched way was to use the burning rose motif while the voice overreads body marks. And in the film, the image is almost abstract and meditative, with just the slight sound of burning and crackling and the folding in of curling petals, which can be perceived as beautiful but also awful. And it stands in for a wounded body, but without re-traumatizing or exploiting. So in our film, you don't get the short skirts or women in high heels leaning over cars. That's not my experience in the industry at all. I didn't come across people dressed like that often, occasionally, but not often. And I certainly didn't dress like that myself. So those are the ways that we tried to challenge and subvert those sort of images that come out. Can I just quickly go back to something to do with going back to traumatic sites like London? It was important to film in London, for authentic connection. But to expand on that question, I felt compelled to go as close to the original site as possible. And in hindsight, I wanted to see what doors opened and what remained shut. I wanted to mine the area for more material. And while I was there, I attempted to push a boundary by knocking on someone's door. However, I was refused entry, and that door stayed firmly shut. And I have interpreted that as a safeguarding act, keeping me and the people who live in that space safe. So looking back on that, I'm very bemused by my attempted boundary crossing. And I think it highlights the difficulties one comes across when one is going back to the original site of trauma. It's extremely feral, unpredictable, and it's a volatile terrain. And so when you're going back in filming, it's quite a danger area. And so these things come up and you can lose your boundaries. The same with writing, although it's safer because you're writing in a book. When the book's published, you can lose your boundaries for a while, and it feeds into sort of mental health issues. So it's important that you be careful and aware of those things when you go to these places and do these sorts of things. I just thought I ought to bring that in.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, let's say how important that part was. It's so, so important because a lot of us survivors, a lot of us are dealing with journalists, publishers who want that trauma. Me, myself, started off an Instagram page 5 years ago, and I kept posting all these horrible experiences that I had until I posted something that I just wrote during an hour's time. It was something I've experienced 10 to 15 years ago, and I wasn't aware when I wrote it and when I published it that I haven't processed any of it at all, which sent me down a hole for weeks, a really deep hole of depression. And you might think like, oh, but you got so many likes, so many people commented hearts and how they support you. That almost made it worse.
Yeah.
because I hadn't processed this, but I had given it away to other people to judge and to feel what I still couldn't feel for myself in that experience. So really important what you said.
Yeah, I know that. I've just done that recently. I really know that one. I'm just sort of coming out of the shock of it. But yes, yeah, that's really important. That's so important to hear that. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool.
One thing that Merrily and I both thought was really poignant was the ending of the film and also the pamphlet, which is many, many stories on prostitution. They end with rescue or with triumphs, with gaining freedom, with overcoming, with restarting. And instead, we finish with remembering in the film very poignantly, like named and with a painting of a portrait of a woman, missing and murdered women from the early 80s and in London prostitution. And that's also where you share with us that you're the only survivor of a cohort of 10 women exploited at the same time in the same area. And the audience isn't given this great hope or relief or resting place at the end. And this reminded us that when we were discussing how to set up this podcast, we're going to be talking about really heavy things for an hour and a half, and then let's end on hope. But we found we're now, about 16 episodes in, that's not always realistic or appropriate to end on hope or to give people relief or comfort. Sometimes you have to end in a painful or an ambivalent moment because that is more honest. And I wanted to ask, what was your intention? On what kind of note did you want to end? And how have audiences responded to not having this classical rescue or success or new start to liberation at the end of the piece?
Well, you pretty much said everything, really, in that. I so agree. The film was never going to end on a high. That wouldn't be realistic. It wasn't realistic. There isn't no happy ending. The impacts on those still living are lifelong, and those injuries have to be managed daily. And the trauma also tends to be repeated in different situations. So I can't really comment on how audience have responded to the ending of the film because we haven't shown it enough and we're at the start of the tour. But when I have performed at poetry readings and read from the book and tried to end up on a positive note or on a positive poem, that's never felt authentic. It's felt very uncomfortable and the audience know it. So actually, I don't do that. But the idea of finishing on a hopeful note is interesting. And I think I'm sort of living proof that there is a possibility to live a reasonable and good life after prostitution. So there's hope in the fact that you can live and you can survive and you can be creative. But to portray that, how you portray that in a reading or in the film is another issue. Actually, each person has to find their own happy ending. It's all relative. So, I think we finished on when the needle goes in the image, only when the needle goes in. And so for some people that wouldn't be a happy ending, but what is a happy ending? It's all quite difficult. It's not easy to do that.
Just as we're talking about, I'm thinking the classical happy ending in movies is dishonest because it's often, it's the rom-com, two people found each other, but we don't know if they're going to make it a year, 5 years, 20 years. We don't know what it's going to be like if one of them loses their job or what if they have children or one of them gets sick. I mean, even the happy ending in films has been critiqued, especially in the setting of rom-coms by feminists, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we have comfort shows and comfort movies, because that's what many of us want, but that's not a format that is, certainly it's not universally applicable. It shouldn't be. And there's a tinge of dishonesty when it is applied. So
yeah, I agree with you on that.
I can just add to this, one of my favorite artists, Tina Turner, but when she was alive, I think this was might have been 2019, 2020. I still can't find that article, but I know that I read it, where she said, "I'm not fine.
Yeah.
I'm not okay." And this was not her saying that every aspect of her life was horrible and had always been horrible. This was her saying that I have a right to feel the pain that was thrusted onto me. And every time that you read about Tina, they always emphasize, oh, she's so strong and she overcome this. You don't ask her, how do you feel?
Mm. Yeah.
And so I think that's really speaks well to, like, with myself, that yes, I did things, I overcome things, but I have the right to feel what I feel for what was done to me without have that taken away for people calling me strong and warrior or all those positive things. That is really positive. I know that. And I have days where I feel like a superwoman and all that, but I have days where I have to be vulnerable. I have to be allowed to feel what was done to me and feel angry and feel upset and not be a people pleaser and just smile and say I'm strong, because you're not always strong.
Yeah, those happy endings are really, pressuring, aren't they? They pile on the pressure.
Yeah, they are. And they look for it. And I think that's what the happy ending is for maybe journalists and people that comes up to you and they're like, oh, but you managed to do this and you managed to do that. Yeah, but that doesn't take away that I never got to be a child, or I hadn't had full autonomy over my own body as a woman. Things like that. It's still out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Chaucer, do you have any advice or recommendations for other trauma survivors how to get started writing with something like poetry or other forms of art? As you already mentioned, there's a certain degree of it being fraught, as in it can be healing, but it can also be the wrong time and the wrong medium or the wrong space or the wrong people to do it. There's no universal advice, but as far as you feel comfortable giving and from your own experience.
I'm not able to really sort of give advice or recommendations, particularly because everybody's at such a different level, as you just said. But if you're thinking of trying to get your story out, if you've got a story and you want to put it out there, and maybe that's even too hard sometimes, but maybe start by writing it down for yourself in a diary, in a journal, so it doesn't have to be published. Nobody sees it. And then if you want to pursue that and you think that you can, or you want a little bit more help with it, just look around, Google it, join a local workshop group, plenty of, places to go online or locally, look for people that might be doing the same sort of thing. But you just have to pace yourself and be very careful. That's all I can say about that.
What I really wanted to ask was, have you written an autobiography? Do you want to write like a beginning to an end of your life kind of biography? Or do you feel that this is what I want to put out? The rest is mine.
Biography, I'll never say never, but no. I write poetry. Poetry is an ideal medium to write about memory and trauma, and poetry by its nature is fragmented. Arguably, poetry is less able to be exploited than straightforward biography. As I mentioned again with Gwyneth Lewis just coming out with her memoir, you just think, wow, I don't know how you can do that. And so, no, I'm more poetry-centred than I am prose-centred. And a biography isn't something I've thought of at the moment. But who knows,
Thank you for that answer. I can fully understand that. Writing a biography like I'm doing right now is something that I might not have said yes to if I understood what that meant. It's very hard. I would rather have waited. And I have some advice to give to anyone who listens. Read it and view it. The Chaucer Cameron work, it is worth every bit of time you put into it.
Thank you. Funnily enough, I've written a load of things for the podcast, and I was just thinking, this feels like a novel, and it's brought up so much. It's so valuable. And I've had sort of writer's block for a while, and this has sort of opened up stuff and brought in things. So, who knows, a biography might come out of it. I don't know, but certainly there's something coming out. Articles maybe coming out of it, definitely. So it's been an incredibly interesting experience, and it's just great to talk to you both.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Good luck with the biography.
Thank you. I need it. I just have one question, and we read poems, and I'm blown away by them, and we watched your movie. Do you have more? Can we find more online that you have published, and how?
Yeah, you can see more of my stuff on my website and on social media, but the book you can buy at Against the Grain, which is my publisher, and they're still operating at the moment. They closed, but they're still operating. So you can get it from me. And yeah, we've put it on Amazon, so it's on Amazon as well. The film-wise is not public. It won't be public until next year. So we're still looking for places to put it. It's not out yet at the moment. It's more of a live experience. And we'll see where it goes and who takes it up and how. You can see the trailer online. There's a link to the trailer that's public. Some organisations or some people really wanted to see it. We're quite happy to release it.
Thank you.
I'll put all the links in the show notes so people can find it. And also, if people want to hear updates, they can follow you on Twitter. Is that the best place to follow on social media, Twitter, or somewhere else?
Twitter at the moment, but I've also moved over to Instagram, and it's not my natural place, and Threads as well. I've managed to get hold of Threads. Helen's on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads as well. Oh, and I'm on Facebook as well. On those platforms, you can catch me out and about.
So we will link all of these below, and we'd love to finish on one last poem of your choice that you want to leave the listeners with.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I've got a poem here that will probably go into my next collection. It is not in this collection. It's called Bloomsbury. Russell Square. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? You hung yourself in Russell Square. The trees still there. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Ophelia, Lavinia, Cordelia. I'd have done anything to please you. Dying is an art, you said, and I will show you how.
We hope you found this episode informative. To follow us on social media, click the links in the show notes below. If there is a topic you would like us to cover, you can contact us at redlightexposé.podcast@gmail.com or head on over to our website, redlightexposé.com. There you can also find a donation page if you'd like to support the show. All the hosts at Red Light Exposé are volunteers, so we rely on your donations to continue to compensate our survivor guests and cover operative costs. Thank you for listening. We hope you tune in next time.